screen. Okay, everyone, enjoy your session.
And can you all see my screen here? Oop, here we go. Where did my mouse go? And I seem to have lost my mouse. Hang on a second.
Okay.
There we go. Okay. Can you all see me now?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay. Okay, good. All right. Well, we should be looking at my initial slide here, and we're going to talk today about Visual Studio database projects. Just a quick bit about me. I'm a Microsoft MVP, certified. I work for Pragmatic Works, obviously, and I've done some books and a lot of speaking, so I guess that's about enough of that. Let's talk a little bit about what is DataDude and why would you want to use it. DataDude was the code name for the original Visual Studio database project all the way back in the Visual Studio 2005 timeframe. And Microsoft recognized the need to have a good database development experience. A simple solution inside SQL Server Management Studio was nice, but it wasn't as full-featured as it should have been. So they came out, and the original code name was Visual Studio 2005 Team System for Database Development Professionals, or some long-winded name like that. So everyone kept calling it DataDude, which was the code name, and as such it's kind of carried on throughout the various versions of it. So what are some of the things you can do with the Database Developer Edition? Well, obviously you want to be able to create projects, and these projects are going to be your databases. The cool thing is with DataDude, and we're going to see an example of this, is that you can reverse engineer an existing database. That's very handy. I'm sure we've all been in situations where the boss wanders over and says, hey, I need you to go make some changes to this database, and you ask where the source code is, and he just laughs and walks away. Another good thing we can do with DataDude is refactoring. Again, we've all been in situations where we want to make a change to a column name, for example. Well, how can we ensure that we're going to hit all of the places that use that column? Because it could be in multiple views, it could be in stored procedures, all these different places. Well, DataDude has some great refactoring tools built in to help us with this very thing. It also helps us with deployment. It allows us to compare the current project schema to the target database schema so that we only apply the changes we need to. We can also generate data as part of this. I'm sure we've all had to generate test data, and you can imagine your requirements that you need to scale up to, say, 500,000, a million rows of data. How do you get all that data in there? Obviously, writing handwritten insert scripts aren't going to cut it. We can also do schema comparisons between either two existing databases or two projects or your project in an existing database. We can also do data comparisons, comparing data between two different databases, and we can actually do unit testing. Let's talk a little bit about the toys we're going to need to use this. The current Visual Studio 2010 is known as Visual Studio for Database Projects, and it's included if you have VS 2010 Premium or higher. Back in the 2008 timeframe, Microsoft decided that if you owned Visual Studio 2008 or 2005 Professional, you should probably have the database version as well. So if you have the Professional, with like an MSDN license, you can go out and download this Database Professional Edition at no charge. Now, if you download the 2008 version, there was a supplemental add-on called General Distribution Release 2, or GR2. And I've got the slides. Same thing for the 2005. You can download it as an add-on to the Professional. With that said, I love slides, but we're going to look at some code. Here we are, Visual Studio 2010. Be aware of what I'm going to show you today. The same functionality pretty much exists in previous versions of Visual Studio. So if you're still on 2008 or 2005, you're going to do pretty much everything you're going to see here. So let's, yes, that's nice. We're running a basic color scheme. So the first thing so here I've just got a blank area, and we're going to go File, New, Project. And you'll see here you've got a database set of templates, just like we've got our C#, C++, and whatnot. We have a database set of templates for which we have SQL Server. Over here in the list, we've got various project types. You can target a specific database environment. For example, if I was still working with 2005, I could pick a 2005 project, or I could do 2008, which is what we're going to do today. Now we have different types. A database project just creates a blank project, and it doesn't walk us through the wizard. You can still do a lot of the same things, but you don't have that nice wizard-like capability. A server project is for creating server objects, such as things you might want to put in your master database. And that's a pretty advanced subject that we're not going to cover in this session. The wizard is what we're going to walk through today. The wizard gives us the ability to go do all kinds of nice reverse engineering. It asks us a lot of questions about how we want to set up our project. So let's go do it in the wizard, and we'll just call the project webinar. And we'll click OK. And now we come up to our welcome screen. That's nice. We'll just click Next. Now it says, what kind of project would you like to create? And once again, it asks us, do we want a server project or a database project? Well, we're going to stick with the database project. Now it asks, how do we want to organize the files within our project? We can organize them by schema or by type of object. I personally am a big fan of database schemas. I know they're designed for security, but they're also really great for organizational purposes. So I tend to use schemas heavily, so I'm going to leave the default set of schema, and I'm even going to say include the schema in the file name, just so that when I'm looking through my lists of files, it's easy to identify what schema something belongs to. So we'll click Next. And here we have some fairly basic settings. Most of these you'll generally just leave alone. You're not going to touch these. The only one you might work with is the default schema. Within the project, whenever you go to create a new table or a new view, something like that, it will automatically prepend the name of the view you enter with whatever your default schema is. Most projects, I tend to create a default schema that is the name of the project, and I use DBO fairly rarely. But for today, we're just going to leave it set to DBO. And we'll click Next. Now, here's the really cool part. Remember a little while ago I said we could import an existing database. So we're going to come up here and we're going to import an existing schema. And I happen to have the AdventureWorks Lite version loaded on here. A lot of people are familiar with the traditional AdventureWorks. Be aware, though, that there are other versions of AdventureWorks. The one I'm going to work with today is called the Lite version. It only has a handful of tables compared to the big one. And that's going to be useful today because it's going to keep our responses fairly speedy. Now, if you don't happen to have this already picked in your drop-down, you can click New Connection, and you can just go fill out this very standard-looking dialog to pick out the server name and pick to the database you want. Here are some various import options. I typically just leave these alone. And we'll come down here and click Next. Oh, let's show you down at the bottom. It says a SQL file is created for each database object that you import, so understand that you're going to have lots and lots of SQL files out there as part of your project. And we set a maximum number of files to 1,000. I've never had that be an issue, but just be aware that if you ever needed to change this, you could do it here. So we'll click Next. And now we have some options around our deployment. And these are pretty important to understand. So if you decide to fall asleep through the rest of the seminar or go get coffee or whatever, try to hang out here with me for just a minute because this is pretty important. The first thing we have is the deployment option. We have two choices, create a deployment script or create a deployment script and go ahead and deploy it to the database. During the deployment of your database, Visual Studio will compare what you have in your project to the target database. We set the target database connection here, and I'm just going to use my local host, and we'll leave the default database name of webinar, and we'll click OK. And of course, I can change my target database name here. Now, in a real-world scenario, you would probably have AdventureWorks Lite Dev, AdventureWorks Lite Test, and AdventureWorks Lite as your production database. At each point, before you do your deployment, you're going to want to come, and I'll show you where to do this in a few minutes after the post wizard, but you're going to want to compare what's in your project to what's in the target. By creating a deployment script, Visual Studio will only generate the changes needed to bring your target up to date with your current project. So let me say that again. It'll compare your target database to what's in your project and generate a simple SQL file that you can then hand off to a DBA, or if you're the DBA, you can then deploy that to your system. Now, it's important that you change your connection before your deploys, because obviously, let's say you've been doing your testing, you deploy the project to testing, well, it's already going to have everything up to date. So if you then turn around and try to deploy that same script to production, nothing's going to work. You really need to make sure that you do these comparisons. Another option down here to note is always recreate database. I like to check this on during the initial stages of development when I'm still working on my local box. This just makes it easy. If I go in and make a lot of changes, it just wipes those changes out and redeploys it to my project. Once, though, I start to work in a shared environment, such as a shared team server or the test server or what have you, you want to make sure to uncheck that. If you don't do it, it's going to wipe out the work of all your coworkers, and you'll be stuck buying donuts for the team for the rest of the year. Block incremental deployment if data loss might occur. This is Visual Studio's way of keeping you from shooting yourself in the foot. If you, let's say you want to drop a column, but that column has data in it, Visual Studio will stop the deploy, generate an error, and say, you've got to go fix that. And it will go, and you'll have to go manually and delete the data in that column before it will proceed with the deployment. So that's a very good thing to have. It keeps you safe, and it makes you really think about the changes you're going to do. The final option on this screen is backup database before deployment. Hopefully, you've got a DBA who will automatically, just out of habit, back up the database before he implements your script. But you just might want to check this on anyway, just for safety. I typically leave this unchecked during my development processes because there's no need to back up the database if I'm just continually iterating it on my local box. So let's click Finish and let it create the project for us. There we go, all done. Click Finish. And it's going to bring up our project here. Go down to the solution. Now, if you've worked in other Visual Studio type projects, maybe you're a VB or a C# guy, the solution structure is going to look quite a bit different from what you're used to. Up here we have our schema objects. This is where the heart of your data is going to exist. We've got our schemas, and we notice we have DBO and Sales LT. There's our Sales Lite. We can keep drilling down to our tables. And here's our constraints, indexes, and so forth. Now, before I get too far into this, before we totally forget where we were just at with the wizard, I just want to show you where to go change those various options. The first place is up here under the project properties. So I've right-clicked on Webinar. I'm going to open up Properties. Here we can set the project version we're targeting. We had set this to 2008, and that's what we want to stick at. We can change the default schema. A lot of times when I'm working on a project, I'll do my development for one schema, get it all done, then I'll move on to maybe a second schema, maybe it's my history or a staging schema, and I'll do the work there. So I'll tend to come in here and I'll change the default schema from time to time as I'm working with various areas of my database. Under build events, you can actually enter some pre and post build commands. I haven't had a need to do this, but there it is. References. On occasion, you're going to need to reference another database from within your current database project. To do so, Visual Studio needs to understand the structure of that database. You can do it in one of two ways. You can actually create a second database project that's part of this solution and reference that second database project from within your webinar project, for example. The second method you can use is to create a DB schema file. Now, when you generate a deployment script, when you right-click on the project and you click deploy, one of the files that's going to get created has a .db schema extension. The .db schema extension is what you reference in this window, and that will allow Visual Studio to say, okay, I know now how to reference that other database from within here. Right now, out of the box, this though only works with other SQL Server databases. And I have had situations where I needed to, I'm not going to touch that other SQL Server database, so I just need to reference it. So all I do is I come in, I use the wizard that you just saw to reverse engineer that database's schema, create the DB schema file, and in a few minutes I've got what I need. If you are unfortunate enough to have to work with a database other than SQL Server, but you still need to reference it, then you're going to have to manually make those changes for that, maybe that one particular stored procedure or view or what have you. Let's come over here to the build, and in here you can see where it's going to write the files to. It's going to put our files in a SQL debug directory, and if you remember, I just said the DB schema file, and here's where you can set the name of it. Okay, so one of the outputs is going to be this DB schema file. Under the deploy, we have a lot of the options that we saw earlier. Here's the deployment script name. It's going to create it as webinar.sql, and that's the file that you'll pass off to your DBA so that he or she can deploy it. Here's where we change those target database settings. So as you move from test to production, you can change that target connection here. Next thing I want to show you briefly is the code analysis. By default, it's turned off, but there's some good code analysis rules built in here. For example, if I expand this, one of the rules it can check for is a select star in stored procedures, views, etc. We all know select star is generally bad, but by enabling your code analysis tools, whenever it does the build, it'll drop down here to the error list, and as a warning, it will say, hey, in this particular module, somebody used select star. And then you can walk over to that person's cube, and maybe they're a new person, doesn't have a lot of experience, and you can give them some gentle guidance or training, or depending on your environment, you may want to whack them upside the head with a coffee pot, whichever works best for you. Okay, there were a couple of other things that we set during the wizard that we should go look at. Up here in the properties, we have our SQL deployment file, and in here is where you can go turn on and off the always recreate database. Okay, so that's a good place for that. And also the block incremental deployment is set here. There's a few other options here. One I want to point out real quick is the generate drop statement. This can be useful, but I suggest using it with caution. What will happen is, well, during a database life cycle, okay, people get in there and they monkey with it. Maybe they want to go do an update to a table. So they just create a copy of that table, and you'll see, I'm sure we've all seen databases with like address underbar back, address underbar temp, these kinds of things. Well, Visual Studio can go help clean those up by just dropping those if they don't exist in the current project. So it can be a useful tool, especially for cleaning up your development environment, but again, you could be losing data that somebody needs, so I would make sure that this is a good option for you. Down below are some advanced options. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into these, but you can look through them, and they've got really nice descriptions out here about what they do. Okay, let's look at one more thing, and that is our SQL settings file. Most of these have to do with items around the database itself. Most of these you're never going to go touch. You're just not going to need to. However, you could have a DBA who you're working closely with who says, hey, we don't use, for example, the primary file group. We always set up a secondary file group, and that's what we want you to deploy to. Some other options down here. If you've got change tracking, you can enable change tracking. Setting the recovery model for backups, just different things like that. Again, most of these you're probably not going to have to go touch, but if you do, and you're not the DBA, then your DBA can tell you what options you should have. Okay, we've now looked at how to set things up, how to import data, and where to go make changes once you've done all of your basic setup. Now we can actually go start looking at code. So down here we have a list of all of our tables, and we can actually drill down, and here's our stored procedures area. We don't have to have anything but some types here. I don't think we have any here. Yeah, there's a few. Here's for doing error logging, so there's some stored procedures in here. And let's actually go look at a table. And here is our sales LT address table. And you can see when you go to create this by default, if you go generate a new table, it'll create the table for you, and then you just start typing in the various column names and their data types and whatnot. Or here, I'm bringing up an existing table, so in theory, I could start making changes. For example, if I wanted to add a new column, I could just come down here, hit enter and create a new column. I can also change an existing column. For example, I could come here and replace postal code with zip code. That presents some problems that we've experienced in the past of how do I know I got them all. Fortunately, as we discussed earlier, there are some great refactoring tools. How do we get to these though? Well, Visual Studio provides you something called a schema view. I have it open here, but if you don't happen to have it open, you can go to the View menu, and Database Schema View is how you bring up this window. And I actually tend to use this window so much that I tend to dock it side by side with my Solution Explorer because I jump back and forth so much. Here in the Schema View, if I expand this, I can drill down, and in this particular view, I have a model very similar to what you see in Solution Explorer. I can drill down to the tables, and let me open up the customer table. Now note, now that I have this open, over here, the Solution Explorer, the little gray highlight bar that says what file you're working with, is kept in sync. So here it shows that I'm on this particular file. If you don't happen to like this particular view, maybe you come from a DBA background, you can click this little change object grouping, which is enabled if you are on the highest level of the database tree. And we'll click it, and now you see a view very similar to what you see in SQL Server Management Studio. I can drill down into the tables, and there's my address table. I can drill down further to get the columns. And there's the various column information. I can see any keys and so forth. A lot of the things that you would do over here in Solution Explorer, for example, right-clicking, add, and say a new table, you can also do here, add table. And this is a little nicer because it's actually context sensitive. It knows that you're on the list of tables, so it knows the only thing you probably want to add is a table. So this can actually be a much faster, simpler thing to work with. And I actually use the schema view heavily, and I suggest that you get used to using it as well. Back to the original point, though, of changing a column name, if I come here and I click on the postal code, I right-click, I then have some options, one of which is Refactor. I'm going to click rename, and we'll change the postal code to zip code. And notice I have preview changes checked on, so I'll click OK. And let me expand this box a little bit so that y'all can see it. There we go. And now you can see when I click, it's actually going to show me a preview of the changes. And here it shows me that there's the zip code. If I scroll this down, we can see that there's looks like a index that it's used on. So it shows me the change here in the index. You can see this little light gray line around it highlighting the field. And I don't seem to have it used anywhere else, but if I did, it would show me the views and the stored procedures and let me preview these. I can even go so far as to click Apply, and it has now rolled through and it's made the changes all the way throughout my project. If my project was checked into a solution control system such as TFS, it would go down and automatically check out all of those items for us and make those changes. So that's a good way to do some safe refactoring. We've looked at the deployment options already. Let's look at doing schema comparisons. Sometimes it's valuable to know what the difference is between a source schema and your project schema so that you can see what those changes are and what changes are going to be made. So I can get to those by coming up here to the data menu, doing a schema compare, and say new schema comparison. And it asks me, what do I want to compare? I can compare my project to a target database. I can compare a source database. Let's say in this example, I'm going to compare this AdventureWorks Lite that I pulled from to my current project. And I'll click OK. And to give us a little more room, I'm going to drag the schema view back in here just for this presentation. You can see here, it's noted that my address table has a different definition. And when I've clicked on it, it shows me that in the source, it's called a postal code, but in my current table, it's called a zip code. I would tend to use this sort of thing when, for example, I was working on a project where I get a call from the DBA who says, oh, hey, we had to make some changes to this database that you're working on in production, so you need to go reflect those changes in your project. And I'm like, well, okay, do you have those changes? Oh, they're just out there on the database, go figure it out. So using this tool, I was able to identify what those differences were and say, apply them to my project. And I can do that if I want to by coming up here to the data, going back to my schema comparison again, and I have the various options. The one we're going to look at is Write Update. When I click Write Update, it's going to say, are you sure? We'll say yes. And it's going to bring my project back into sync with what's in the source system. So if I come back here to the address columns, you can see my postal code has reverted from zip code back to what I had in the source. Obviously, you have to be careful that your current changes don't get wiped out from what's in production. So you have the option here of coming in and skipping options, skipping columns and update actions that you don't want to occur. Just like we can do database comparisons, schema comparisons, we can do data comparisons. Let's go ahead and deploy our project. And we're going to right click and we'll do the deploy. And it's going to think about it. Oop, looks like we had an error. Let's see what that error is. Okay. Looks like it's trying to, oh, I know what the problem is. When we did our comparison, it reverted the target name back to the AdventureWorks name. So let's go to deploy and our target database name for webinar. Here in our database level objects, under storage, files. Here it's changed its name from our webinar name back to AdventureWorks because that's what was in the schema. So this is a good example of what can happen if you do a comparison, you're not real careful with the changes you make. And make sure the log file also gets changed. And then we should be able to deploy. And we'll save everything. Oh, we don't need to save the schema comparison. And we'll come up here and we'll try to do the deploy again. Okay. Well, it looks like it's going to give us some headaches. So fortunately, I have another project out here in my AdventureWorks test area. And what I wanted to show you was doing a data comparison. Do a new data comparison. And we can compare one database, such as AdventureWorks LT, to a test database. This is one I was working with earlier. And I can compare records that are different, only in source, only in target, or identical. And so we'll click Next. And then it asks us, well, what do you want to compare? By default, it does all the tables, and it can also compare views too if you wish, but we'll leave that unchecked. And I can come here and I can click Finish. Now here, everything was identical, but if it wasn't, then it would actually show us the differences and say, well, these are only in your source, these are only in your target, and I can actually come up and view, for example, through this, I could do write updates, I could see a script that would generate those changes for me, and I could then turn around and manually apply that script, or I could have it automatically apply this. The big things I've used this for in the past are, number one, we have data in the production system, and that data is causing us issues. For whatever reason, it's caused a bug in our program, and we need to go get that data into our test database. So that's the first time I use it. The second place I use it at is quite often we'll have a gold standard for our test database. Somebody will go out and they'll create a test system, and that test system will have a specified set of data in it that covers all of the various test conditions that have been identified. Well, as developers, when we go through and we do our own testing, we wind up changing that data. So by using this data comparison tool, all I have to do is compare my current project database to our gold standard test database, and I can make everything fall in the sync again for my next round of testing. Okay, so far we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about creating a project. We've talked about doing some refactoring. We've covered a lot of the deployment options, which are quite important. And we've looked at doing some schema comparisons, and we've looked at doing some data comparisons. The next, and this is to me kind of one of the biggest features of the Visual Studio tool, is the data generation. Okay, the ability to go generate realistic looking test data. So what I've got here is I've created a new data generation plan by going into Data, Data Generator, and I can go create a new plan, what have you. Right here, because I've got an existing one open, and I've got it set for customer. Let's actually go look at one for customer address, let's say. And we can do a preview of the data generation, and you can see here, I get some pretty ugly looking data. Okay, it's just gobbledygook. Okay, the same thing for, let's go look at product, and here we're previewing this, and you can see I've got product name, AAA, product color, AAA. This color itself, just gibberish. Okay, so you can imagine that if I try to actually go look at this in the database, it's not going to pass any kind of validation rules. It's going to be really, really ugly. To help us with this, Visual Studio allows us to generate templates, okay, using what's called generator output. So if you see down here, I have the list of columns that I'm going to generate data for. And I'll bring this up a little bit. And you can see here I've done a few of them. Of course, by default, our primary key is an integer value that's an identity column. So Visual Studio is smart enough to go, oh, okay, it's an identity column. We're not going to touch this. It's going to take care of itself. The next thing we're going to look at, you can see here's the name style, and we've set it to a bit generator. Okay, there are various kinds of generators that are available to us within Visual Studio. Okay, it knows that this is a bit field, so it says the generator I'm going to use is the bit generator. It's going to take the default output, and here it's going to pick either a true or a false in my name style. Now, let's look at down here. For any varchar type field, it's going to use the default of a string generator, and it's going to use a generator output of just a standard output. So you can see here for suffix down here, if I just stick with the standard string generator, I get gobbledygook. Okay, and I left this in here so you could see that. I also have the option of using something called data bound generator. Data bound generator, I can tie this particular column to a field in some table somewhere. So if I come over here and I look at the properties, you can see I have a connection to my local host, and I can pick various ones that I want. Down here, I can pick a distribution, which I've set as uniform, which is the default. I can specify how many percentage of these I want to be null. So you can actually generate a certain number of null columns into your target database. By default it's 0, but you're free to change it. I'll explain seed value in a few minutes. Then I have the select query, and this is just a valid select statement. And I've got a database I'll show you in a minute, but it says select first name from the set of the table first male names, and I'm going to union that with the first name from the female first name table. Okay, and this is to show you that you don't have to write just a simple select statement. You can actually write some nice, even complex select statements as long as they return a single column. And you can see here down in the example, it's gone to that particular table, and it's returning some valid-looking first names: Vito, Bethany, Rosie, and so forth. Now, another really nice tool that we have is the regular expression generator. With the regular expression, I can simply enter an expression, and here I've just said, give me a letter from A through Z for the middle initial, instead of actually using something out of the system. So this is just to kind of show you that you can use regular expressions with a string. Down here I have regular expressions for a phone number, and you can see here I'm going to get 3 characters from the range 0 through 9. I'm going to insert a literal dash, then 3 more characters from the range, and then another dash, and then 4 more characters from the 0 through 9. And the output is some nice realistic looking phone numbers. Okay. You can also do the same thing, like say email addresses. I could do some concatenation. I could select a random email address from a table, anything like that. And I left a lot of these unset, but you get the idea. There's our company names, which I'm doing another select statement of selecting the company name from my database. Let me just go show you real quick. One of the things I have done is set up something called the SQL name game. And in it, and I've got blog posts on this out there, which you can go look at later. But here I set up a wide list of data, and I took these from, for example, my set of first male names. I've got, I think, grand total of a couple of thousand names that I pulled out of the Census Bureau's list of names from 1900 all the way through today. So you can see I've got a lot of different names out there, and I can use these as kind of a random pool for generating my data. And I've done the same thing in many different databases, or many different tables. So, I've got an interesting list of cities, states, and zips that I can pull off of. I got these off of one of the U.S. Post Office sites. And I've just got a wide list of just tables of data. This is a very handy tool to keep in your toolkit, because using these, I can then turn around and generate realistic looking data for pretty much any kind of system I want to create. And as we all know, it's much easier when we're doing testing to have good realistic looking data, stuff that we can look at on a report that looks right, versus data that's just all that gibberish stuff that may even crash, say, a web browser when it comes back to it. So let's jump back to Visual Studio. And I wanted to show you something too. With this seed value, each field has a seed value. So when I come here to the first name, you can see down here, everybody remember my first name is Gail, Elise, Draven. So let's come back up here and let's change that seed value from 5 maybe to 6. Now you can see my first names have changed. Cheryl, Lenora, Benita. So what happens is when you change that seed value, Visual Studio changes the algorithm by which it goes out and formulates the data. The cool part, though, is if I come back here and I change it back to the 5 it originally was, note I go back and I get the exact set of names that I had the first time. So while the seed value is random, it's what they call predictably random. By using the same seed value, I'll get the same set of data every time. This can be really important during your test and development process. Okay, I think we've covered pretty much the main things. I do want to mention one or two other little scenarios. I don't have a date column in here, but let's see. One of the things I can do with my data-bound generator, I can also use what's called a sequential data-bound generator. So I can get specific data in a specific sequence. So maybe you had a list of salesmen and you wanted to make sure that each salesman had a value. You would start with Fred, then George, then Harold, and work your way through your list of salesmen. And it would just do it in order. The same kind of sequence also works with a date column. Let's see, I believe the sales order detail has dates in it. Yeah, modified date. And here in the date columns, we can set a date range, and I can set a step value of, in this case, it's 1 hour, so I can go from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., what have you. When I set unique values to true, what's going to happen is Visual Studio will start with the very first date, the min value, and as it inserts each row, it will increase by the amount in the step value until it either reaches the number of rows to insert or it reaches the max value, in which case it loops back and goes to the start. Now, note too, earlier I said we could change the number of rows to insert. By default, it's 50, but I can change this to 500, 5,000, 5 million. I'll warn you, though, that if you do that, you want to make sure to turn off your data generation preview, and you can do that by simply closing the window. But I have had situations in the past where I had rows to insert set to an especially high level, and when I had the preview window on, it generated some out-of-memory errors within Visual Studio. So just be aware that you want to leave rows to insert to a low value, until you're actually ready to actually go out and generate those rows. Then turn off the data preview window, and then actually go out there and start generating your rows. Okay, we're getting close to being out of time, so that we'll have some time for questions. I'll just mention real quick, it is possible to generate unit tests. To do so, you simply come over here to the schema view, and you would pick, say, a stored procedure. Let's actually sort this by our object grouping, programmability, and as you'll notice, I jump back and forth between these two views quite a bit depending on what I'm doing. Let's go to stored procs, and you can come down here and say create unit tests, and it gives you a list of all the items you want to do, and it says, okay, I need to create a new project to hold these unit tests. And you can give it a project name and create a new class. This is going to become part of the existing project. You can click OK. And here in the Solution Explorer, it's added a new class, and I already had a unit test project in here. But this lists my unit tests, and I can write simple T-SQL code, execute that against my, in this case it's a stored procedure, and look for certain results. In this particular case, I have an execute statement to execute that stored procedure, and I'm selecting my return code and my error log ID, and what I'm looking for is a not empty result set. So in this case, result set 1 must have at least one row. Okay, and I have a wide variety. I can do pre-test code, so I can actually go insert something before the test, check for things after the test, do cleanup code. Here I only have the one object, so I can only test one thing. I can set up some of this information over here in my properties window. Let's go back and check on that again. And up here is where I can give it the name, tell it whether it's enabled or not, and set the result set number. I could actually come down here and enter in more code, such as trying this with a different result set that I know won't be there. So I could generate maybe I want to do a select where return code equals 22, because I know 22 won't exist in the database. And when it comes back, I can set my test condition to no rows, for example. And here you can see I can look for an empty result set. That's how I would do what I just described, just through an empty result set. I can look for an expected schema, not empty result set. I can look for a particular row count, so I can make sure that I get one and only one row back. I can look for a scalar value. Maybe I've got some sort of financial calculation, and I know that if I pass in certain values, I should be getting a result of 1, 2, 3 back, for example. I can verify that I do indeed get that result of 1, 2, 3 back. So that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg of unit testing. There's a lot there you can do with it. And that just kind of gives you a little brief overview. Let's jump back to the slides, and we'll continue here. And I just kind of want to wrap this up. I like to leave folks with a few resources they can go to get more information. Unfortunately, right now on the market, there is no single book out there that discusses everything about database projects. There are, however, chapters in a few different books that will cover the subject. The Professional Visual Studio 2010 book has 2 or 3 chapters that talk about it, as does the Application Lifecycle Management book, and they all cover Visual Studio 2010. There's also a pretty good book over here on Pro Visual Studio Team System. This was written for the 2008 edition, but everything you'll read in here is still applicable to the 2010 version, and in fact the screens look pretty similar. So if you wind up getting this book, you'll be safe, and that everything that's in there you'll be able to use today. If you decide, books are nice, but I like the online stuff, there are some good online links you can go to. First, there is a reference to the sample database that I was showing you earlier, my SQL name gang database. There's also the DataDude blog, Visual Studio Database Development Tools Forum, and then the actual home for Database Edition. So that kind of wraps up my main presentation. I'll have the material available on my blog a little later today. I'm also on Twitter if you want to follow me there. And I think we'll turn it back over to our lovely hostess to help manage questions.
Thank you, Robert. That was a really great presentation. We do have a few questions. Jari would like to know, Project 2008 R2, where is it?
From a database perspective, there's no real differences between 2008 and 2008 R2. So when you pick the 2008 wizard, everything in there will also work with 2008 R2. 2008 R2 was primarily upgrades in the business intelligence area, such as some new graphing types, that kind of thing. When it comes to the core database stuff, there weren't a lot of changes within R2 that were really applicable.
Okay, great. Brett would like to know, does it make changes in SVN as well?
Yes. Yeah, we use it with Visual. We have a Visual SVN, and I've used it there to make consolidate the changes and do the reconciling.
Okay. Jake would like to know why.
I assume you're talking when you say SVN, you're talking about Subversion.
We'll wait for you to respond and see if that answers your question. In the meantime, Jake would like to know why some of the data was not in English.
That data that you saw was just random gibberish, and then the data that was coming from my SQL name game, those were just the names that were there from the U.S. Census Bureau database. So a lot of those names in there that you saw were dated back to the 1900s, 1910s, and so forth, when there was a lot of immigration going into the United States. So those names were just what was in there.
Oh, okay, interesting. I was wondering the same thing myself,
Yeah.
So that's great. Brett said that we did, in fact, answer his question, so great. We're glad we could help, Brett. VS would like to know, data generator had no coercible output. What does that mean?
I think no coercible output, just let me go back and look at it, but I think that just meant it wasn't going to output any data. We'll go back and look, help jog my memory. Let's see, data generator, and we'll do the preview. Yeah, no coercible output means don't output anything to this column. Okay, just ignore it when you're generating data. Okay, and you can see here, title doesn't have anything going into it. So it won't, it's not that it's going to put a null there, it's just not going to include that column when it does its database updates.
Okay, great. VS also has the second question. Can we change the class for unit tests to C number?
To C number,
C pound, maybe C sharp. There we go. Thank you, VS. I'm in marketing.
Oh.
I don't know all of your coding.
And the answer is yes, absolutely. Typically, you don't have to go monkeying with the code under the hood, but yes, when you set up the unit test project initially, you can pick either VB.NET or C# as the underlying language.
Okay, great. Kevin would like to know, is a specific server role level or level role required for creating a database project?
There is. I don't remember what it is off the top of my head. I believe it's. Tell you what, I'll find that out and I'll put it on my blog. I apologize. I don't remember off the top of my head what it is, and it's more like a database reader or reviewer. I'll have to go, like I said, look it up.
Okay, great. We have one last question. If I don't have any U.S. Census name data, how should I generate my random names? Form an existing database?
You know, there's all kinds of ways you can do it. The simplest way I would say is to find a good online source somewhere of names and use those, just put them in a simple table in your project or in a project somewhere. And you can just type in a handful of names if you want to. You can see here my first male name table is just very simple. It's a single column, first name. I just made it Veracure 25. You could just type in names to it if you wanted to, or pull them off the web somewhere. But that would be what my recommendation was, is to create a simple table and either manually enter some names or go find some spot online where you can pull it into. Now, if you have good data, production data, and you're allowed to use that production data in your test database, then I would use the data compare tool to pull the production data into your development database and use that, because then you have some really good, rock solid, realistic data. It's just that I've worked in many, many places where you weren't allowed to use production data as part of your test system. So in those cases, I've had to go in here and resort to the data generation tool.
Okay. This was a great presentation, Robert. I really appreciate it. I learned quite a bit. For instance, C#. I learned that. That was great. As always, everyone, our session has been recorded and will be available on our website by the end of the week, so please check back under our webinars and view past recordings. And thank you very much, Robert.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Everyone have a good week.